Today I'm going to give some tips for Masters Toronto, and this is going to be quite an interesting video because I think it's just an interesting dilemma that Masters Toronto VFL is going to provide for you, I think, and this video is probably going to show that. So we already had a tips page from last time in stage 1, and a lot of these tips are still perfectly reasonable, right? Like having fun, that's a good tip. Having a couple premium players so you can have them as your IGL, yeah. Map points are more easily predicted than killer bonus points, yeah. Fixtures matter as much as players is a good tip. But the thing is, with tips like that fixtures one at the end there, obviously in the Swiss stage, you only know the first fixture. You know, it's not like stage 1 where we had all the fixture lists and you could plan out, oh, well, they're going to play this team and this team. When we're picking the players in the Swiss stage, you only know one fixture and you don't know who they'll play up against next, whether it'll be easy, whether it'll be hard. You don't know if that team then makes it through to the playoffs, who they'll get. You might be like, oh no, they've got G2, they've got no chance, right? But you got to stick with them. There are parts to Masters Toronto that I think, you know, definitely carry over from, you know, stage 1 in terms of general advice that is good advice, but there are also other parts to it that might not fit in so well. And the reason for that is you're going to get 3 transfers per game week, right, in between the different stages. So let's say we pick our initial Swiss stage team, right? We obviously need at least 3 of those players to get through so that for the start of playoffs, we can have a full team of 6, right? There is no bench, so picking teams that actually get through to that next stage is going to be very, very important, right? The thing is, though, how do you best guarantee that you will have at least 3 players of your 6 go through, right? What is the best way of doing that? Because the risk reward is quite interesting, right? Because, for instance, you could just pick, you know, 3 teams that you feel really good about and pick 2 players from each of those teams. And if you're right, you're in an amazing spot, right? If all 6 of your players go through, you know, the Swiss stage and are into the playoffs, well, that gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of, you know, for those 3 transfers. You know, you'll have a lot of different things, a lot of different options available to you, right? Whereas if only 3 players of your 6 go, well, then you have to get rid of this guy, you have to get rid of this guy, and you have to get rid of this guy. And, you know, maybe, you know, you pick a player here and they're playing G2 in the playoffs and it's not looking good for this guy, right? But you have to keep him because the other 3 are scoring 0 points no matter what, right? So you're like, well, I've got to get rid of these 3 anyway. There is a very interesting dynamic here, I think, in terms of how risky you want to play it, you know, versus how spread you want to play it, right? How many, you know, combinations of 2 do you want, right? Because again, do you want to go, you know, betting on just a bunch of 1s from each team, you know, just get 1 player from 6 different teams? Well, you're going to get some players in the playoffs for sure. At least 2 of the players will be in the playoffs. You will have at least 2. It could go disastrously for you and, you know, you end up with 4 going out. It could go well and you know, 4 manage to make it, but that's the point. That's like, yeah, you're spreading out the risk quite a lot, but you're probably not maximizing points because some of those players are probably going to be on losing teams. So that's definitely going to be something to solve. I think probably for me, probably the best way of doing it is to at least have 1 pair of 2 that you feel particularly good about, and then maybe going for a bunch of 1s, kind of like, you know, as somewhat mitigating the risk. Maybe some of these play each other so that you can, you know, guarantee at least one of them is 1-0, and you have to hope basically that the draw goes your way. So I do think that how well you do in Masters Toronto will somewhat be to do with that risk reward. It should get a little easier in the playoffs because at least then you can somewhat map out, you know, generally who's going to play each other, right? Like, for instance, if this was like G2 XLG up on this side, and let's say they got, you know, some teams that you thought were a bit weaker out of the Swiss, then you might look at G2 players and go like, okay, well, I feel pretty good about them winning these 2 games. Right, so let's go for that. There is also the other complication, though, of course, of playing 3 games. Whilst not an advantage in terms of the overall, you know, points you'll score, obviously it does give you an extra game to potentially pop off, right? Like a player could still do very well in a losing performance. You know, it doesn't happen most of the time, but, you know, if someone gets 2 aces but their team loses, right, that's probably going to be up there in terms of their performances. So you're not going to get punished as heavily if your team just loses 1 game, but if they lose both, of course, then you're kind of screwed. The other thing I want to talk about, though, is the final stage, because of course by the time we get to this final four game week here, generally what's probably going to happen is that the best of 5s, I mean, there's just more maps, right? So it's just likely that that's gonna be your highest scoring 2 games you know, if someone goes, like, if Team A here goes from the upper final into the lower final into the grand final and they play 3 games, most likely is that the lower final and the grand final will be their highest scoring games, right? And obviously there'll only be 4 teams left, and you can only have a max of 2 players per team. So what I would suggest is you almost certainly will want 2 players from the upper final teams, because they are guaranteed to at least play one best of 5. Right, which will give them the chance to get a lot of points in those maps, whether it's close or whether it's not, right? As long as they don't get absolutely blown out 3-0, you know, they should get a decent amount of points from this best of 5, right? And obviously then someone has to win, so they're going to get a decent amount of points here in the grand final. So when we get to game week 3, basically you'll want 2 players from each of these teams, and then you might go 1-1 here for this lower, but you might decide, obviously, one of these teams is only playing this one game that isn't a best of 5. So if you can predict this correctly this game, you know, and get 2 players into the lower final as well, that's going to be pretty good for you.